When Eli and Hannah and I were transitioning from ministry in Denver to ministry here in Palm Beach, we decided to take a longer time to drive across the country and come down here. Not because we needed to, we knew where we were going, heading to Palm Beach, to Bethesda-by-the-Sea, but we wanted to have a journey, a time together to make that transition something, a time to delight in one another, to catch up with some family and friends, to just make that transition spiritually and mentally and emotionally, to leave one place and arrive somewhere else. There is some phrase, I think, isn't there a phrase, Margaret, that says something like, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey, or something like that? That's certainly, right, is that roughly, that's it?
I think that's right.
Yeah, and it's a good phrase for Christians because that certainly characterizes the Christian life and the life of the church. All too often we think that somehow we're supposed to have arrived somewhere to find a place, to get it all right, and then just to be there, with nothing ever changing sort of again. And while it's true that there are parts of our life of faith that are changeless, those are mostly about God. They're very rarely those changeless, permanent pieces. They're very rarely about us. They're mostly about God and God's character. The character of the church, the character of our life, is one of being on a journey, on the move, or, I love the word, or being peripatetic. Isn't that a great word? So you remember, 3 weeks ago we talked about the church being characterized by being Catholic, 2 weeks ago about being prophetic, last week about being empathetic, and this week I want to talk about the basic character of the church being peripatetic. Almost no one, certainly in the early life of this Jesus movement, characterized that peripatetic nature of following Jesus more than St. Paul. Paul, man, did that man get around. He went from Israel through Syria all the way across the Mediterranean, ultimately to Rome, stopping in all kinds of places in what is now Turkey and Greece and Macedonia, and then again ending up in Rome at the end of his life, hoping to go all the way to Spain, which at the time he did that was a massive amount of travel that was essentially, roughly, covering much of the known world. And he did that not because he just had a wanderlust, not because he was interested in seeing places, but because he knew that for him, his life of faith had to be on the move. It had to be going somewhere, accomplishing something. Because his faith and our faith as well can't just be about us and our well-being. Right? Our life of faith, our relationship with God is always about what we can do to bring the kingdom of God into reality in the world around us. There's always some progress, some movement that we're called to make on behalf of the world. Now, the church has always wrestled with exactly how we do this. There was a book written in the 1950s by a guy named Richard Niebuhr. Did you read this book in seminary, Margaret? A book called Christ and Culture. Did you read it, Father Burrell?
I did not.
You did not? There were several decades where this was like the one book that was required reading of every seminarian in every Episcopal seminary, and probably a lot of others as well. It's probably since been replaced by something. But Niebuhr wrote this book trying to sort of give a framework, if you will, for the different ways that Christians have understood their relationship with the world around them, or culture was the word he used, but the ways we related with the world around us. And he very quickly said there was one way, which generally was to say, world is bad, Christian faith is good, repudiate, stay away from, shun the world, and retreat and be somewhere separate. And while there are people who have a vocation to solitude, the separation from the world is simply a means to an end of fulfilling that vocation. It's not the way we're supposed to, the way we relate to the world is not of the essence of that. And so monks and nuns do that, for sure. But most of us don't do that. The other way, which doesn't work, is just to say, oh, the world is just good and it's all fine, and so we just live in it, and because God's here, it's all good and neutral. That's probably not true either. So for most Christians, somewhere, we look at the world and see parts that need healing, that need redeeming, that are lacking in that sense of God's presence and that vision of God's justice and compassion. And Christians, in all kinds of ways, have worked to impact the world around them. And so Paul says to the church in Rome today, he says, look, you can't think yourself better than someone else, but everyone has gifts to share. Everyone has some part in the work of the church, bringing the kingdom of God into reality in the world around us. Some are teachers, some are prophets. We have all kinds of roles and gifts that we exercise, but we do it because there's somewhere we're going. There's some journey that we're on together to realize the kingdom of God. And so for us, it's not enough to say, well, I have my faith, that's my own personal thing, and then I live in the world and they're separate. They're not separate for Christians. That doesn't work. And we also can't say that if I'm a Christian and I have this way of doing things, that it must be okay because I'm a Christian and that's what I'm doing. That's not true either, because we get things wrong as individuals and as a church. But part of how we sort of wrestle through this is those roles of being prophetic and empathetic. The fact is the church has to care for everyone, and the church calls us to strive for justice and peace. That's that prophetic role. And so acknowledging that we don't get it perfect, we can't just give up and stop. Paul wouldn't want us to do that. Paul didn't do that, and didn't let his followers in his communities do that either. So I want us to think about that today. It's particularly weird, isn't it, to think about being peripatetic when we're locked in our houses most of the time, not going out. There's an irony about that. But here's the thing. It's still true. The church still has work to do. You should have read in the email blast this last week, that did go in last week's email blast, right, Burl, on Thursday, that this wonderful stuff about what we're doing for outreach to serve the world. Because we're still doing that work of God, even when we're staying closer to home and isolating some. That time will go away, and we need to look back on this time of isolation and be able to see what God has been shaping in us, how God has been developing these gifts, and how we've been able, even in this isolation, to be peripatetic, to be on the move, to be growing and transforming the world, to be about that work of realizing the kingdom of God. I know Paul didn't understand the church. Paul was part of a Jesus movement of these followers of Jesus, growing and spreading around the known world at the time, on the move every day. And I know that he would agree with me in reminding all of us that is essential to who we are in our life of faith. We're not static, stable, changeless people. God is changeless. We are always on the move. And I think Paul would agree to remind us that the church is called to be peripatetic.